So we've gone through the square root method, we've talked about factoring. The third thing that I'm going to look at is completing the square. So with completing the square, I'm actually going to go back to the square root method before. I'm going to write it a little bit differently. So the square root method, what I originally said was this, was a times x squared minus p equals 0. So I'm going to kind of get rid of that for a second. It doesn't matter that it's an x, right? I can make it a heart, I can make it whatever I want. I have a times something squared minus p equals 0. How did we solve that equation? Well, the first thing we did was add p. Then what did you do? You divided by a, then took the square root, remembering that there were two of them. So it doesn't matter that it's just an x. If I have anything squared there, I can move the p over, divide by a, and then take the square root. So that's kind of the idea with completing the square, is that I want to get to this stage. I want to get to a times something squared minus p equals 0, because then I know how to solve it. We've done that. So completing the square, kind of do the same thing we did before. I'm going to have the example here and then the steps over here. So the example that I want to do is 3x squared plus 12x plus 4 equals 0. Step 1. I want you to group your x terms. So what do I mean by that? Every term that has an x, group them together. Okay, so that was pretty easy. All I did was draw a blue line. Next, what I want to do is I want to factor out the x squared coefficient. Now what's my x squared coefficient? So come over here. My x squared coefficient is a 3. So factor that out of those two terms we just grouped together. So there you go. I had to factor out the 3, so that's what I did. Next, you're going to take the x coefficient and you're going to divide that by 2 and you're going to write it down. I'm going to put this in all caps. Make sure you write that number down. So what number is in front of my x? It's a 4. Divide it by 2 and get a 2. Write that number down. That number is going to be important. Okay. Next, what are we going to do? Well, we actually need a little bit more room. So I'm going to write the equation with more room. So my equation was 3 times x squared plus 4x, leave a little bit of space, plus 4, leave a little bit of space, equals 0. Good so far. So really all I've done is factored out that 3 and divided 4 by 2. That's really all we've done at this point. Take the number that you wrote down, so take the number written down, and you're going to square it. So the number I wrote down was a 2, so if I square it, that gives me a 4. Maybe I'll put this in a different color, so I put a 4 right there. Well, the thing is, you can't just go adding stuff to equations, so you got to fix what we just did. So what did we just do? Added that 4 right there. But how did that change the problem? Well, if I add a 4 here, because this 3 is being distributed, I really added a 12 to the problem. So if you're going to go adding a 12 to the problem, you better subtract a 12 to the problem. That way it's the same problem, right? You can't just go adding numbers. That doesn't make any sense. You gotta fix it. Okay, so let me write this a little bit clearly. So I have 3 times x squared plus 4x plus 4 plus 4 minus 12. So that's the same line, just written a little bit differently. Next, you're going to factor. Now I know we just went over factoring, but it's actually not that bad here because remember that number I told you to write down? That's always going to go here. So it's always going to factor as your a times x plus whatever number you circled. And then I'm going to simplify this a little bit. So that 4 and the negative 12 become negative 8. So this term factors to be x plus whatever number you circled. And then number 8, solve. Remember when I said we're going to solve something that looks like this? Yeah, well there it is. There's my a, there's my something squared, minus p equals 0. How do you solve it? Well, we said the first thing to do would be to move that 8 over. The next thing to do would be divided by 3. Okay, so we're back to this. I need to take the square root of both sides. Remember there are 2 of them. And now x isn't by itself. This is kind of the last step. X is not by itself, but it's not that bad to make it by itself. Just move that 2 to the other side. So I get negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 8/3. So it's either going to be negative 2 plus the square root of 8/3 or negative 2 minus the square root of 8/3. Those are going to be your 2 options. But this is my solution. Now it seems like a lot of work, and we're going to do 2 more of these, but it's actually not that bad in practice. The hardest part is going to be this. Dividing by 2, writing it down, and then fixing it. Those are going to be the 2 hardest parts, but we'll do more. Second example I want to look at, 2x squared minus 4x plus 5 equals 0. I want to complete the square on this. I don't want to factor, I want to complete the square. So the first thing I'm going to do is group my x terms. Now factor out that a. I'm going to go ahead and leave a little bit of room. That's a 2. So I factor out that 2, which made the negative 4x go into a negative 2x. Divide that term by 2, and that gives me a negative 1. Square that number. Well, negative 1 squared is 1, so I'll put a 1 there. But now I got to fix it. So when I put that 1 there, I really added 2 to my problem because of this 2, which means I need to subtract 2. Now I'm going to factor. Remember, it's always going to factor as x plus that number. Well, in this case, it's really a negative number, so I get x minus 1, and then that gives me a 3. Now what do we do? Now we're going to solve. So I'm going to move the 3 to the other side, divide by 2, and now what do? Well, I need to take the square root, but what's the square root of a negative? There isn't one, so we say there's no solution, because you can't take the square root at that point, so you're done. Now I want to come back up here and talk about how we completed that square one more time. So, use green here. First thing I did, put parentheses around my x terms. Factor out the 2, so that's where this 2 came from. Take this middle term, divide by 2, and give me a negative 1. Write that number down, super important. Square that number and put it here, but then fix your equation. That's where this negative 2 came in. Then factor. Remember, it's always going to factor as x plus this number, that's why it's super important. Well, x plus a negative 1 is x minus 1. And then try to solve. Well, when we tried to solve, there was no solution, so we'd say there's no solution. Let's do one more of these. Let's go with x squared plus 6x plus 5 equals 0. So I'm going to try to solve this by completing the square. So first step, there are my parentheses. Next step, factor out what's in front of x squared. Well, here's the nice thing. We don't have a number there, so I don't have to worry about factoring anything out. But I'm going to rewrite the equation anyway and put a little bit of room. Next, divide that by 2 and I get a 3. Write it down, super important. Now what do I do with that 3? I need to square it and put it there. But I can't just add 9 to an equation. I got to fix it. Well, the nice part is there's no number out here, so to fix it you just need to subtract the 9. And now we're going to factor. Remember, it always factors as x plus whatever number you just wrote down squared. So I get this equation. Now I want to solve. So let's see, to solve that equation I'll first add 4. Take the square root. How many square roots are there? 4? Hopefully you know there are 2. There's the plus and minus 2. And then subtract that 3. So I get negative 3 plus or minus 2. Now what does that actually mean? So if I say x is negative 3 plus or minus 2. So a lot of times I see the students write that down but they don't know what it means. It means two things. Either x is minus 3 plus 2 or x is minus 3 minus 2. Well, in the first one that would be what, negative 1? In the second one you get negative 5. So writing these two things down are exactly the same statement. This says that x is negative 3 plus 2 or it's negative 3 minus 2. So it's either negative 1 or negative 5. So that's completing the square.